Let's continue our lessons in hymns, stories of our hymns. These are good ones today that I found, and we're going to enjoy these. Okay, obviously the scriptures provide a lot of inspiration for these hymn writers, and one in Matthew chapter 10 provides the story for this one. Are not two sparrows sold for a farthing, and one of them shall not fall on the ground without your Father? But the very hairs of your head are all numbered. Fear ye not, ye are of more value than many sparrows. That was the inspiration for this hymn writer, Sylvia Dufresne Martin. She was born in Jordan Falls, Nova Scotia, August 21st, 1866. As an adult, she earned a living teaching school. She met and married Walter Stillman Martin, a Baptist minister. Traveled with him in his church work, but then because of somewhat poor health, she remained at home during much of his travels. But she's credited with writing the words to several hundred hymns and religious songs. It's amazing to me, most of these writers wrote hundreds, not thousands. And she describes the circumstances which prompted her to write the words to this certain hymn. She told this story. It was in the spring of 1905. My husband and I were traveling in Elmira, New York. We contracted a deep friendship for a couple by the name of Mr. and Mrs. Doolittle, believe it or not, true saints of God. Mrs. Doolittle had been bedridden for nearly 20 years. Her husband also was an incurable cripple who had to propel himself to and from his business in a wheelchair. Despite their afflictions, they lived happy Christian lives, bringing inspiration and comfort to everyone who knew them. One day while we were visiting with the Doolittles, my husband commented on their bright hopefulness and asked him for the secret to their happiness. Mrs. Doolittle's reply was quite simple: because his eye is on the sparrow, and I know he watches me. That woman's simple expression of faith impressed Sylvia and was the catalyst for the words of the hymn that she went home to write that night. Shortly after writing the words, she sent the words of the hymn to well-known composer Charles Gabriel, and in his memoirs, he wrote this: one evening, while in a despondent, downhearted mood, I was glancing over some song words. Just nothing appealed to me that night. But then I remembered having received a hymn in the day's mail, which I had not yet looked at. I took it from my pocket, and it seemed like a voice was speaking directly to me as I read. And the medley immediately rang out of silence into my heart, exactly as we sing it today. I wrote it out, and in a letter to Mr. Alexander the next day, I mailed it to England, where in Albert Hall, the Sparrow Song was first sung in public. You already know what it is. Why should I feel discouraged? Why should the shadows come? Why should my heart be lonely and long for heaven and home? When Jesus is my portion, my constant friend is he. His eye is on the sparrow, and I know he watches me. And don't you love the chorus? I sing because I'm happy. I sing because I'm free. For his eye is on the sparrow, and I know he watches me. He closes the chapter, he said, may we all have faith like Mr. and Mrs. Doolittle, to carry on and trust that God's eyes are not just on the sparrow, but on every one of his children. Is that not just a great story? Two cripples. I'm happy because his eye is on the sparrow. Simple perspectives, but boy, deep in meaning, is it not? Any thoughts, questions on that? I haven't sung that song in a while. That needs to be on our list coming up.
I love for somebody to sing it. It's a hard one for me to play.
Oh, okay.
And so that I don't pick it a lot of times, and used to we did you know, somebody just tell me what you want to sing, we sing, and I'll go. I love the song, but I did never enjoy.
So basically, you need a week or two to practice.
Yes.
Okay.
Or 3. Yeah.
I always think of this song, Billy Graham's Crusades, because what's her name? Was it Ethel?
I know who you're talking
That
about.
sang it, you know, the black lady sang this song so many times on Billy Graham's.
And you know, his crusades, they always sang the same songs. The gentleman sang what? With the
I'd rather
break
have Jesus, he sang that one.
Yep. And of course, he always closed out with Just As I Am. And people never got tired of the same song, regardless how many crusades he did. And he did a bunch. Okay. I thought this was a great, great story. And you already know I love historical stories. This was by Dwight L. Moody. He starts out saying, many ships have been lost at sea, but oceans are not the only place where there are maritime disasters. The Great Lakes, which straddle the United States and the Canadian border, have over 8,000 documented shipwrecks. I did not know that. Lake Erie, which is one of the 5 lakes, covers itself 2,000 shipwrecks, among the highest of all wrecks in the world. The high rocky shore from just east of Cleveland to west to Cedar Point combines with shallow water, sudden squalls to create one of the most dangerous stretches of water in that area. This location was likely where a tragic event happened which motivated a writer to pen the words for a certain hymn. And what it is, Jeff? The Reverend Dwight Moody, 19th century evangelist, told this story in one of his sermons of a ship that was nearing Lake Erie Harbor at Cleveland, Ohio. It was a dark night and a violent storm produced punishing waves. Range lights were used in harbors and consisted of 2 lights, one higher and set back from the other. When those lights lined up vertically, one exactly above the other, the pilot knew the ship was positioned correctly to navigate the channel. On this particular night, the lighthouse was shining and was functioning as the upper range light. The lighthouse keeper's job was to tend the tall lighthouse as well as the lower range light lanterns. However, for some reason that night, the lower lights, which were absolutely essential for safe navigation, were not working. Seeing only the lights from the lighthouse, the captain asked the pilot, "Are you sure this is Cleveland?" "Quite sure," replied the pilot. But the captain said, "Where are the lower lights along the shore?" "Gone out, sir," replied the pilot. "Can we make the harbor?" asked the captain. To which the pilot replied, "We have to, sir, or we will perish." The pilot steered the vessel on what he thought was a course towards safety. But without the lower lights, he missed the channel. The ship struck upon the rocks, and many lives were lost in the cold, stormy Lake Erie waters. Dwight Moody ended his sermon with this admonition: "Brethren, the Master will take care of the great lighthouse, but may we always keep the lower lights burning." You know the story yet? The hymn yet? Let the lower lights be burning. A young man named Philip Bliss, I've seen his name on some of our hymns, he heard Reverend Moody's story, and he wondered if someone's negligence or misfortune had caused the deadly wreck. Then he questioned if he as a Christian had neglected to do his part. Was he doing enough? Was he an example in reaching out to bring others who might be drowning in sin or misery or even to a knowledge of Christ? Shortly after the sermon ended, he picked up his pen and he began writing both the words and the music to Let the Lower Lights Be Burning. Brightly beams our Father's mercy. from his lighthouse evermore. Remember, the lighthouse was the top one. But to us he gives the keeping of the lights along the shore. Let the lower lights be burning, send a gleam across the way. Some poor fainting, struggling seaman you may rescue, you may save. Dark the night of sin is settled, loud the angry billows roar. Eager eyes are watching, longing for the lights along the shore. Trim your feeble lamp, my brother. Some poor sailor tempest tossed, trying now to make the harbor in the darkness may be lost. How many psalms was the word billow used in? Man, you just saw that. I guess that was a word sort of like ours in our culture today. The hymn was first published in 1871 in a Sunday school hymnal. I didn't know Sunday schools had hymnals. And it became extremely popular immediately. Churches throughout the land began singing the hymn, and it's blessed millions ever since. In the New Testament, Jesus said this, "Inasmuch as you've done it to the least of these, my brother, you've done it unto me." Are you doing all you can to keep the lower lights burning to help others in the city? Wow. Well, I love that. I love history stories anyway. But, so many of these just born out of that. Who was trying to find these? Not available. Any questions, thoughts on that? How many times have we sung that great song? And I wonder why I never questioned it. I wonder what those words mean. I just never did. I just thought, it really sounds good.
Yeah.
I like the song. But I never said, well, I wonder why they wrote that. So God decided that he'd wait till I was in my 60s to figure all that out.
Never really did, I guess I never really thought about what the lower lights mean.
I didn't either. I always thought the lighthouse is one big beam. I guess that reaches out to them long distance, but in order to stay in the channel, because the rocks were so ragged and the water was so shallow after a storm, I guess that washes the water out. They had to stay in the channel. If they got off of that, it's going to crack.
Pretty smart idea to do that. Pretty smart idea to do it.
Oh yeah, absolutely. But the lower lights that night were burned out. When I first started reading it, I thought it was going to be the lighthouse song.
I did.
The writer changed my mind. So that's one I didn't know. So move on to the next one. Coles Hill, England. Oh yeah, this is great here. All right. One day in 1842, a visiting congregational minister, Thomas Salmon, paid a visit to a friend where he lived in Coles Hill, England. Salmon described the visit in this way. I became acquainted with W. Walford, I guess he's almost my cousin, a blind preacher, a man of obscure birth and connections, no education, but of a strong mind and the most amazing memory. In the pulpit, remember this guy's blind now, but he still preached. He never failed to select a lesson well adapted to that particular subject, always giving book, chapter, and verse with precision and scarcely ever misplacing a word in his repetition of the Psalms. Remember, he's blind, he can't read it, so he has to memorize it. That's why they say he has such a sharp mind. His repetition of the Psalms and every part of the New Testament, the prophecies, and some of the history books, as to have the reputation as knowing the whole Bible by heart. Man. He actually one night sat in a chimney corner, using his mind to compose a sermon or two for his Sabbath delivery. And his hands in cutting, shaping, and polishing bones for shoehorns and other little useful implements. When he wasn't doing that, he attempted to write poetry. On one occasion, paying him a little visit, he repeated 2 or 3 pieces which he had composed and had no friend at home to commit them to paper. He laid them up in the storehouse of his memory within. "How will this do?" he asked the visitor as he repeated the following lines, with a complacent smile, touched with some light lines of fear lest the subject himself be criticized. I rapidly copied the lines with my pencil as he spoke them. Reverend Salmon left England in 1842 and returned to the United States in 1845. Salmon submitted an article for the newspaper, the New York Observer, in which he offered the poem that was composed by this blind preacher, William Walford, with this tentative proviso, "If you should think them worthy of preservation, please publish them." The editors felt this tender poem was worthy of inclusion, and they published it in their paper in September of 1845. Just published the poem now. 15 years later, a composer by the name of William Bradbury decided to set that poem to music. It was a lovely and touching hymn, and it gained slowly in popularity until it was finally published for the first time in 1878 in a Methodist hymnal. After the hymn was established in the hearts of Christians everywhere, scholars and students went back to find this blind poet, William Walford. They never found him. He remains a mystery yet unsolved. We cannot say for certain who he was, or even if he was the least bit familiar with him. Yet the poem he wrote speaks of a man familiar with his God and the power and intimacy of a personal prayer life. He wrote, "Sweet hour of prayer, that calls me from a world of care, bids me at my Father's home, makes all my wants and wishes known. In seasons of distress and grief, my soul has often found relief, and often escaped the tempter's snare. By thy return, sweet hour of prayer." Remember, he was sitting in a chimney corner, polishing bone for shoehorns. And he paused and thought, this is a good poem. You know, how powerful is that? Hundreds and hundreds of times we've sung that. I think I just did the first verse. What are some of the other verses?
Sweet hour of prayer, sweet hour of prayer, thy wings shall my petition bear. To him whose truth and faithfulness engage the waiting soul to bless. And since he bids me seek his face, believe his word and trust his grace, I'll cast on him my every care and wait for thee, sweet hour of prayer.
Mm-hmm. Lots of blind and crippled composers and writers here. Which just really shows you how God doesn't care about our disabilities. He will use you in such a great way. Does it have William Walford in there as a writer?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And is it Bradbury as a composer? Bradbury as a composer. Okay. All righty. Didn't know this one either. Okay. This is from Knowles Shaw. He quotes the passage from Galatians from the Apostle Paul. "Whatever a man sows shall he reap, for he that sows to his flesh shall of the flesh reap corruption. But he that sows to the Spirit shall the Spirit reap life everlasting. And let us not be weary in well-doing, for in due season we reap if we faint not." Just from that scripture, want to guess what that hymn is?
So in the morning, so in the evening.
Ding, ding, ding. Move to the front of the class, Miss Bell.
What's the name of it?
They keep up with the harvest. Let me see. What title does he give it? Bringing in the sheaves. Yeah. Morning, good morning.
Good morning. How y'all doing?
We're
We're
good.
doing great.
Hope you are.
All right.
We're talking about the history of great hymns here. So the law of the harvest certainly always been a powerful point of teaching gospel principles, especially those who live close to land that was being farmed. For one well-known evangelist, the harvest was a metaphor always reaching out to gather souls to Christ. Knowles Shaw, born in Butler County, Ohio, October of 1834. They moved to Rushville, Indiana, where Albin was, this is his parents here, was a farmer, stock dealer, and merchant. When Knowles was about 13, he stood at the bedside of his dying father. Albin gave his son a prized violin and the advice as follows: be good to your mother and prepare to meet thy God. Knowles dropped out of school. He worked hard to provide for his mother and 2 sisters. He was a quick learner and acquired many skills just by careful observation of others. One neighbor said that Knowles Shaw's head was like a tar bucket where everything that touches it sticks. Albin would have been proud of his son's effort to care for the family. However, the second part of the father's advice, to be a God-fearing Christian, was forever or totally ignored, not forever. Knowles worked diligently to learn to play the violin, which his father had given him. In fact, he gained a measure of fame in that area just because of his musical skill. He frequently played with bands at dances and parties where alcohol was served. Then one night, while playing his violin at a dance, a most unlikely place for any thought of eternal welfare, the advice of his father seemed to forcefully come to his mind, and he stopped in mid-song, stood and said, prepare to meet thy God. It seemed like a voice from the grave, and a message from heaven from that moment on rested on his soul. The song ended, and the dancers just called for another song. To the surprise of everyone, Knowles put down the violin. He walked to the middle of the floor, and he shared with the group why he had said what he just said. He shared with them his father's dying words and expressed remorse for neglecting his religious commitments. He then declared at that moment that he would never again play the violin for another dance, and asked the group not to hinder his ability to lead a Christian life. From that hour, he kept his pledge to honor God. He became a faithful church member, and for the next 2 years, he worked as a farmhand and even married one of his employees' daughters, Martha Finley. However, Knowles felt a call to the harvest of gathering souls to Christ. He worked tirelessly in the churches he was assigned to, having the ability to connect with every social level of people in the communities where he preached. Knowles Shaw became one of the best-known evangelists in the Restoration movement, where our churches come from. At 6 feet 3 inches tall, he was an imposing presence. And because he was an exceptional singer as well as musician, he was often called the singing evangelist, integrating hymns into his sermons as part of his message. He was credited with writing over 40 songs that he always sang in revivals. It seemed fitting that the title of one of his last songs, written in 1874, was dedicated to the memory of a fellow preacher bringing in the sheaves. He is remembered for bringing thousands of people to a knowledge of Christ, and the words of the song express the zeal he felt in his calling. Sowing in the morning, sowing seeds of kindness, sowing in the new tide and the dewy eve, waiting for the harvest and the time of reaping, We shall come rejoicing, bringing in the sheaves. Haven't sung that song in a while either. You gonna put that on your list there, Lee? Is that one hard to play too? Okay. You remember what, I think, two TV shows, I remember seeing that on Little House on the Prairie and Andy Griffith. They were always singing that song. Like they said, politically correct, it didn't offend anybody. Last part of the story. In May of '78, Shaw left his wife and family at his home in Columbus, Mississippi to participate in a month of gospel meetings in Dallas, Texas. How's that for a revival? A month long. On June 7, 1878, he answered a call to conduct a revival in McKinney, Texas. While riding there on the train, he was talking to a Methodist minister, Mr. Mallory, when a broken rail caused the train to jump the track. The train car they were in flipped 3 times before landing in some standing water 40 feet below the tracks. According to Mr. Mallory, Shaw had saved his life by pushing him out of harm's way in the wreck. 27 people on the train were injured. There was only one death, the singing evangelist. According to Mr. Mallory, Noel Shaw's final words before the accident were, "It's a grand thing to rally people to the cross of Christ." The final verse of Shaw's hymn seems a fitting tribute to the young farmer violinist who committed his life to bringing souls to Christ. Going forth and weeping, sowing for the Master. Though the loss sustained, our spirit often grieves. When our weeping's over, he will bid us welcome. We shall come rejoicing, bringing in the sheaves. Well, that ought to be sung at funerals. If you know the story, it makes sense there. Wow. Last words about the cross bringing others to salvation. Okay. All right, so we covered 3 or 4 there this morning, and we'll be hopefully seeing them in the next few weeks. Okay.